Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law Podcast, brought to you by Digital Law and produced by Anson Evaluate. As a bit of background, we at Digital Law are a niche law firm specialising in working solely on technology and cybersecurity matters. In each episode, we look at the recent stories in the news related to digital technology around the world, with a specific emphasis on data protection and cybersecurity. For more information on the stories that we will be covering this week, please check the links in our show notes. By way of an introduction, I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK, and I'm joined by my colleague Peter. Peter, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Peter. I'm a solicitor and a managing director at Digital Law. And the idea is that these discussions give you a flavour of some of the conversations we have in the office on a regular basis. And there's been a few, I think, more off-the-wall stories this week. It's not just who's been hacked.
Yeah.
There's a few other quite interesting things to look at, so I'll pass back to Amelia to start diving into them.
Thanks, Peter. I definitely agree with you there, that we are certainly looking at things that don't outwardly jump in terms of being under something that we would cover, but it's quite nice to break away from kicking people for being hacked.
It is, because I think the key thing is that while those are some, I suppose, the stories that we think of are topical for these discussions that we put out on the podcast, this is actually going a little bit more into actually the more like the sort of day-to-day stuff that we do around the sort of the ancillary relation of law and technology, which is the great thing about this. So, yeah, I'll let you dive in.
Thanks, Peter. So I will just go through the story titles that we're going through in today's episode. So first of all, we'll be taking a look at a firm's libel claim over Trustpilot reviews, which has been rejected by the High Court. Then be looking at Network Rail's use of AI to read passengers' motions. The Post Office's apology after the sub-postmaster data leak. The first million breached Ticketmaster records released for free. Apple accused of breaking EU competition rules. And finally, can I dismiss an employee filmed behaving badly at Euros? So just before we dive into today's stories, here is a little bit of background information on our podcast producer, Anson Evaluates. Anson Evaluates are a consultancy company offering a variety of services, including data protection training, outsourced data protection officer services, and specialising in advising clients over multiple jurisdictions. And coincidentally, they've just celebrated their 10th anniversary as well. So please do take a look at their website that is also included in the show notes as well. So diving into the stories for today, we are looking at the Trustpilot reviews first. So essentially, the High Court has struck out a libel claim from a Leeds firm, which claimed to have lost out on work through defamatory online reviews. The debt recovery specialist BW Legal had sued website Trustpilot over 20 reviews that brought down its overall rating. The firm said the hostile reviews had caused the loss of a potential $3.7 million in profit from a potential contract to provide debt services for telecoms company 3. However, His Honour Judge Lewis, sitting as judge of the High Court, granted summary judgment in favour of the website, saying that the firm had not been able to show how many bad reviews had caused a serious financial loss. So, Peter, what are your thoughts here?
So, really interesting case this, because we've had, over the 10 years that Digital Law has been operating, we've had quite a few instances where clients and potential clients have come to us saying, there's this bad review online, we're not happy about it, what do we do? And in this instance, this law firm has said, well, not only do we have a bad review, they've then said, well, we think we can prove that we have a loss here. There is this £3.7 million contract that we would have had, in our view, were it not for the bad reviews that we had. And they made the claim thinking, we will make this claim based on this feedback that seems to have been provided that says, these 20-odd reviews on Trustpilot were sufficient to sway 3 away from awarding them the contract. And it seems from having then sort of gone through the analysis that while they had said this was the basis upon which the contract was lost, the more granular analysis then that the court has carried out appears to suggest, well, actually, there were only 3 reviews on Trustpilot at the time the contract was not awarded. And that, if anything, the claimant was unsuccessful in being able to accurately say, we had this loss, and we wouldn't have had this loss were it not for Trustpilot. So it seems actually it wasn't actually quite as straightforward as BW Legal wanted to make out. I think that's the key thing to really emphasize here.
I think as well, going back to even the reviews themselves, how often do you realistically review a product or service with a good review? You know, how often do you think, oh yeah, this is such a fab product, I've had such fab service, I want to leave a review? Probably not quite so often as when you're very cheesed off having experienced poor service or poor product, and therefore think, right, I want to warn other people off. And I think there is that misconception that reviews are face value, whereas actually they should be taken with either a pinch or a very large helping of salt, depending on how you look at it.
And I think that's just it. And the judge here said that, look, you haven't been able to prove a direct corollary here between the decision that 3 made and these reviews. They weren't able to prove that anyone at 3 had looked at these reviews, certainly not able to prove that looking at those reviews led to not getting the contract. And that's the key thing here, that they just could not establish, certainly to the court's satisfaction. And clearly on this instance, they're saying, look, you simply haven't supplied the evidence. So for the non-lawyers that are listening, summary judgment is where the defendant has turned around and said, we're making an application for immediate judgment based on the evidence before the court because we don't think that you've proved the basis for your claim. And the court's gone, you know what? We agree.
Yeah.
So this is just a summary judgment, and already they've turned around and said, well, yeah, but we are going to appeal it. I think one of the other key things here as well is that when you actually go into it, the negative or purportedly negative reviews were not from clients.
Interesting.
And this is quite often the case. So one of our clients is a hotel, and they contacted us once saying, oh, we've got this negative review on here. And the hotel owner was particularly upset because he said, look, the person making this complaint, they aren't even a guest. They haven't even paid to stay at my hotel. And they've put up this negative review just because they happened to attend an event. I think it was like a wedding reception or something, where they felt that they had this issue with the service and they were putting on this negative review. And I'm not happy about that. And at the time we said, look, it's actually, rather than you now putting all effort and getting aggravated about this review, it's one negative review. The other reviews on here are all really positive. And do you really think, as you said, Amelia, is it necessarily the case that people's decisions on am I going to stay at that hotel or not are going to be coloured by one review that they happen to see on a review platform? So sometimes that element of, is this proportionate or not? Yeah. And arguably that's the thing here. The judge is saying what would have just been 3 reviews on Trustpilot at the time, would that have been sufficient for this multinational communications company to withhold a £3.7 million contract from you just on the basis of 3 reviews from people that weren't actually your customers? I think that's where he's saying this just falls to the ground.
Seems a bit far-fetched. I mean, if 3 are widely known, you'd think, someone from their back end would do their due diligence before thinking, oh yes, 3 proxy Trustpilot reviews is the straw that breaks the camel's back on this one.
Yeah.
Likely not. I mean, I could be corrected, but it doesn't really seem like that would be the case.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, at the end, there's the usual sort of disclaimer where from the law firm saying, whilst we are disappointed with the decision overall, we are considering our next steps, including an appeal. So, this is going to run further. And it could well be they even might apply to set aside the summary judgment saying, well, actually, here is the audio recording of the phone call where the person from 3 said, we're not giving you the contract because of these negative reviews. That would sufficiently change what currently the basis of this decision has been made on. Or it could be that they would have some written evidence that would make a difference. Or it could be that they can show that an IP address associated with someone at 3 had viewed these comments on Trustpilot, though how you get hold of that evidence would be difficult to establish and will probably involve experts and, again, rather a lot of money. But the point being is they may argue, oh, we have more evidence here to bring to bear. Though if you had got more evidence, would have been a good idea to put it before the court before they produced a very long judgment that if people are sufficiently bothered, you can go and read in full. So for the budding lawyers out there, it's BW Legal Services Limited versus Trustpilot. Take a look at that.
And it will be, so obviously we will link the stories in the show notes, and within the story there is actually that link there as well. Moving on to our next story, we are looking at Network Rail and the fact that they secretly used AI to read passengers' emotions. So the company says they put cameras at some ticket barriers to check on customer satisfaction and maximize advertising and retail revenue. Well, for someone that generally doesn't walk around with a massive grin on their face, I have to admit, I travel by train quite regularly, and 9 out of 10 times, I'm probably doing it with a fairly sullen look on my face. Train travel is not always straightforward nor exciting, therefore glum is probably the expectation.
Yeah.
But to know that potentially I could have been recorded here, because I think where have we got? Network Rail have been running a trial since 2022 at stations including Waterloo, Euston, Manchester Piccadilly, Leeds, Glasgow, Reading, Marsden, Dawlish and Dawlish Warren. So I know a few of those that I've passed through since 2022, and quite frankly, I'm not very happy about it. And I'm sure other people aren't too. And it was quite interesting actually reading some of the comments, as comment sections are always the most interesting part of the story. It's like, so you needed to use AI to figure out people were not happy, did you?
Yeah.
But nonetheless, the issue here is not just about the fact that this was taking place, it was the fact that people didn't know about it, and the fact that this information is being analysed by Amazon. So Peter, I'll pass over to you on that one.
It's funny, the more I look at this story, the more worrying it gets. First of all, when I'd looked in the list of stations, it was Waterloo and Euston. You kind of think, oh, is this just they're monitoring the commuter lines that, of course, used to be the bread and butter for the rail network, where it was all the people commuting into London 5 days a week that provides a lot of the revenue. But actually, because in particular, it's saying, oh, we've used stations like Marsden, Dawlish, and Dawlish Warren, and you think, well, I don't even know where that is.
I think that's Cornwall.
Yeah, in fact, I didn't even know Dawlish had a station, but it turns out it does. But the point is that so not only have they gone to that end of the line in Dawlish, but they've gone to Manchester Piccadilly, Leeds, Glasgow, Reading. These are all actually very large stations, a lot of traffic going through there. And this isn't just, at first you think, oh, it's the rail network, so, is this one of the train operating companies, as usual, making more money than they really know what to do with, so this is what they're going to put in. When, in fact, the rail network isn't making any money and hasn't really done since COVID. But then this isn't the train operating companies, it's Network Rail, which is government owned. So wouldn't they know? And this is like, how joined up government works. So Network Rail seemingly has done this without being aware of the explicit guidance from the UK Information Commissioner, which they had said in 2022 that you taking video for emotional analysis was risky.
Exactly.
They made it very clear.
And I think we've previously even looked at some of the enforcement in this podcast about, I think it was Clearview AI, and how they have been using this technology, and a few other like convenience stores that have been using technology to track potential thieves that come in and shoplifting without knowledge. And again, they face quite severe regulatory action, and yet here we are.
Yeah, there's been a problem with the supermarkets doing it. I think it was the Met got in trouble for putting cameras up covering that massive plaza in front of King's Cross station in London. So when you've got people pouring out of St Pancras and King's Cross and that big plaza that very often is an event space, at one point they had cameras up there and they were using AI to potentially profile people and work out, is there any quite slightly dodgy behaviour here and someone loitering or doing whatever. But the point is that they're starting to make this sort of value decision, and the person might not have done anything, but it's just being profiled. So we start going into the sort of the rather dark world of something like Minority Report, where it's like, well, we think you've done something even if you haven't. And you can argue there might be some value in that from a security perspective if you were trying to work out, well, could someone potentially be behind an act that could cause a loss of life on the rail network? We were very conscious of those sort of security risks over the course of the last 10 or 15 years. But in this instance, that's not what we're talking about. We're trying to just record emotions in this instance for the purposes of customer satisfaction. And like you say, if you're getting off a train at any point in the last 2 years, you're probably not very happy because it was probably either chock full of people, late, or the actual train you wanted to get was cancelled, so you're running late because you're now on a later train. So you don't really need AI to tell you that all your passengers are not very happy.
Exactly. And like you say, Peter, more and more people are not even using the service in itself. So is it an accurate representation of what's been going on anyway?
Yeah.
Probably
But
not.
I think this is also, though, just in context, this is a story to think about, because increasingly you're finding that there's actually a lot of, we know there's a lot of CCTV in the UK compared to other countries per capita anyway. But next time you're out and about, particularly in stores, just look out for how many times you now see someone and they're wearing a body-worn camera.
Exactly.
Police do this routinely.
I think even as other supermarkets may do the same, but I was in
Supermarkets
Lidl
are doing it.
the other day, and the person I was checking out with had a body camera on. I'm like, crikey, it's Lidl's on Saturday morning.
Yep. Even if you're going to pick up your coffee from a store now, apparently baristas regularly have these things, and it's all behind, it's to keep people safe. But you're routinely finding now that people are recording and using these cameras on a regular basis. And that sometimes people have then found they've received notifications saying you're now banned from Lidl or wherever, just based on the fact that you were recorded and we're of the view that you might have been potentially about to do something we don't agree with. So you're therefore banned.
And
it's
we
almost
covered
like the
this
idea
story
of, yes.
the other week, actually, only on the podcast, whereas I think it was a lady that had said she'd been wrongly banned from, I think it was Home Bargains or something, because
exactly.
she had been purported to have stolen a chocolate bar. Realistically speaking, it had actually been someone else. She had no idea what was going on and was obviously very frustrated and upset by this. And then they turned around and said, sorry, we got it wrong. And that's not really adequate when it's not really an efficient way to monitor people. And actually then thinking about kind of data and where this is then kept and how it's been securely kept and who can access it. Opens Pandora's box and a world of problems.
It does, and the problem is twofold. One, the technology is still often very immature. It can jump to quick decisions. So this profiling it can do might actually be misinterpreting what it's seeing. I hate to say it, very often there are issues around diversity and inclusion, insofar as it will make certain decisions with regards to a minority that it might not pick up or recognise or understand. So, for example, it might see the face of someone with a disability and go, oh, they didn't have a good rail journey. And it could be like, well, no, because they are visually impaired, that is the look that they have, or because they have, who knows what. But it could make value decisions based on very unfairly on that. So not only have you got that element of profiling, you've then got the fact that there's no clear appeals process on this. How do you submit evidence to say, no, it wasn't me that stole a Mars bar? You are mistaken. I've never stolen anything in my life.
Exactly.
There's no statutory appeals process on this, and let's face it, should there be? But the question is that these things, this is all being established by private corporations, and it's the public as customers that will end up being on the receiving end of it.
I certainly think this is a story we're going to be continuing to look at, and I think it will continue to develop as more and more people, one, are using this sort of technology, but two, are then complaining about the use of the technology, because as we've just outlined, people don't have an appeals process. They are wrongly identified as individuals that are, thieving or, doing something that is undesirable. And I think certainly something that's going to continue to be looked at by us and others.
Indeed.
Moving on to our next story, we are looking at the Post Office apology after sub-postmaster's data leak. So the Post Office has apologised after it published the names and addresses of 555 postmasters it pursued during the Horizon scandal. The company confirmed personal details had been shared in a document on its website and said it had referred itself to the ICO. One former sub-postmaster said the breach had caused upset, distress and anger, and added that data leak was preventing people from trying to heal. And in response, Chief Executive Nick Reed apologised and said the leak was a truly terrible error. And I think it's worth mentioning here that the inquiry is still ongoing in terms of the Post Office scandal. So, Peter.
Well, let's put it this way. Nick Reed, Chief Executive of the Post Office, this isn't the first time he's had to apologise for the behaviour of the organisation under his predecessors, and it probably won't be the last either. But in this instance, he's not actually saying sorry for something that happened on someone else's watch, Paula Venables or any of the other senior management. this is something that happened on his watch. So it's just showing that even though the post office is trying to, I think, say, oh, this was all down to people previously, and we're not actually quite as terrible anymore. It's almost like they're still kicking the sub postmasters when they're down.
Yeah.
You know, you can't even be trusted with the data that you have on these people, who you still, in the majority of instances, have not compensated for the wrongful convictions that they had. Bearing in mind, many of these people have lost their jobs, and then they've lost livelihoods. They very often ended up becoming ill off the back of it. They could have lost family. You know, the loss that many of these people have already gone through is immense before then having, congratulations, all your information has been published online. It doesn't fill you with confidence about the way the post office operates. Bear in mind that the post office isn't just where you go to for stamps and to send mail. You know, it is the in-person spot for the administration and supply of benefits and support for a lot of people.
Exactly.
And
especially then, if you are thinking of those who have benefits and support, you are likely to be a vulnerable person in of itself.
Yeah.
So therefore, you are handling people that potentially you could be handling sensitive personal data as well.
But in this instance, it's the details of the 555 sub-postmasters who had been on the receiving end of pursuit during the Horizon scandal. Not a good look. And as you say, this probably will have been referred to in the ongoing inquiry. Unfortunately, the way that these inquiries work in the UK is they take many, many years to actually get anywhere. And then a very long, lengthy report will be produced, and on the back of that, someone might actually act on it. A lot of people will wring their hands and say that they're sorry, but in the meantime, what's actually being done to help the people, of which there are about 2,500 sub-postmasters who were wrongly convicted during a 15-year period before anyone was held to account for it. So this just, you're almost adding it to the pile of insult that these people are already having to deal with.
Yeah, exactly. And on that note, let's move on to the next story, I mean, talking of kicking someone when they're down,
yes.
I mean, next story is not much better. So the first million breached Ticketmaster records have been released for free. So I know that we previously covered in our podcast the fact that I think you're asking for millions and millions to buy these records. But actually, the cyber criminal gang acting under the name Spider gave away the first 1 million records that are a part of the data set that they claim to have stolen from Ticketmaster and Live Nation. And the files are released without a price for free because they essentially said that Ticketmaster doesn't care, so we're going to release them for free and for fun.
Yeah.
So we're not really going to go into too much detail here, but it's just rather that this has happened and it's an ongoing process.
I think as well, it's quite timely just to think again about this because we are in music festival season in the UK. It's actually stopped raining and people are going to then spend weekends in fields and listen to music. Glastonbury is this weekend,
my hometown. Yeah.
But you realise then that, of course, there are hundreds of thousands of people that will have purchased tickets for gigs and events, not just the festivals, but also, you know, that we've currently got Taylor Swift's Eras Tour, the record Eras Tour.
Which has already been under fire. I mean, Ticketmaster have already messed up on that front. I think they've been sued in America for the US tour.
Yeah.
I think there could be some issues as well with this tour. I believe that some tickets have been sold twice, and therefore people were not allowed in some cases and some venues. So Ticketmaster are not already in the best view of the public, and this is not going to help.
No, and unfortunately, because it's kind of all pervasive, very often I think it's quite difficult to end up going to various high-profile gigs and not having to go through Ticketmaster to get your tickets.
I mean,
and then
I've been to 4 gigs this year, and all of which I've had to go through Ticketmaster.
Yeah.
So there we go.
Indeed. So not great. Well, I think it's just you have to just think about that. Unfortunately, each time you enter your payment card information to buy a ticket for a gig, but there you go.
Can you see the grey hairs coming through? Because
yeah.
Moving on to our next story. Apple have been accused of breaking EU competition rules. So the European Commission says preliminary investigation found that the tech giant was in breach of the Digital Markets Act. So the European Union regulators have accused Apple of breaking new digital competition laws by imposing rules in its App Store marketplace that prevent app makers from pointing users to cheaper options elsewhere. So this is quite interesting because the act only came into place in March. And essentially, it's a series of regulations that attempt to prevent large tech companies from dominating digital markets. Specifically here, it's the first time EU regulators have used the new rules on a tech giant. So this is a first here, and I think it could go one of two ways. So Peter, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, so the Digital Markets Act is the part of a large package along with the Digital Services Act to regulate the digital single market that's been introduced by the European Union. And as part of the process, they have designated what they call gatekeepers, i.e. large platforms that then provide access to either smaller merchants and then put those merchants in touch with consumers. So in the same way that Apple, through the App Store, is classed as a marketplace, so is Amazon, so is TikTok, so is Meta, surprise, surprise. All of these big platforms. Now, it's interesting that the first target of the ire of the EU regulators is Apple, because they could have gone for any of those other corporations we've just mentioned. Of course, the one unifying factor, unfortunately, is they're all American, apart from TikTok. And TikTok, of course, even though it has a US board and US investors, is the parent company is domiciled in Beijing. But apart from that, all of the platforms are US based and indeed originated. And it's interesting that in the US, the view of increasingly the view of politicians there is that the Digital Markets Act seems to be specifically targeted at US corporations. And they say, well, the reason why there isn't an EU one on the list is because you regulated out of existence any innovation that could have potentially led to a European Facebook or a European Amazon. So in the meantime, we then have the view that, hang on, we feel that Apple is abusing its market position, which is the outcome of this preliminary investigation. And there are different things that could happen. Like GDPR, there is a regulatory fines matrix attached to this that means that corporations could be fined up to 10% or of global revenue, or 20% if the offence is, in the view of the regulators, repeated. 10% of Apple's global revenue in 2023. Global revenue was 380 billion, so that could be 38 billion they could be fined. If it's a repeat matter, it could be 76 billion that they could be fined.
And we were taking a look before we did this recording, and this would be the first piece of enforcement that would break that billion barrier if they decided to then go along with this kind of fines matrix. Because as we discussed, I think the highest fine to date had been around the 700 million mark, was it 800? Yes. And that was Amazon fined £636 million for breaking or allegedly breaking EU.
It's about $700 million ish.
Thereabouts,
that was the Luxembourg regulator that led that piece of enforcement. But I think that the thing with this as well is that because this is a preliminary finding, it's almost like, okay, we're taking a look, this is our preliminary view. This will be the trigger now for an immense amount of lobbying from Apple and their lawyers to the European Commission saying, no, we shouldn't be fined for this, and this is the reason why. So that will take months until we get to a more final finding on this. And I think it would be surprising if any final decision is as black and white as this preliminary outcome seems to be. And it could be then that, various excuses and reasons are given, and that might then be given as justification as to why a large fine should not follow.
I mean, nonetheless, though, while this is the first kind of fine or piece of enforcement of this kind, therefore, I'm sure that this will end up kind of setting some level of precedent moving forward, even if it's just how they will handle this kind of big level of enforcement.
And indeed, it remains to be seen as well what the direction of travel is for the EU on this, because while they have this law, we've just had European Parliament elections. There was a recent EU meeting of EU leaders. They've then tried to set out who's going to be President of Parliament, who's going to be in charge of foreign affairs. There are an awful lot of appointments and things that might mean the direction of travel ends up changing within the EU. That means that actually they don't want to nail an American corporation to the wall as an example to the rest. but this remains to be seen. As I say, these investigations do take a long time to run, and it may well be the case that the political wind has changed a little bit by the time it comes to any final decision. But also, as I say, there'll be a lot of lobbying in the meantime as well. A lot of vested interests are potentially being interrupted with here, both in terms of Apple and also I'm sure the US government will have something to say about this as well.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our final story of the day. And this is looking at whether you can dismiss an employee filmed behaving badly at the Euros. So every time there's a large sporting event, there are questions like this. And the simple answer, realistically speaking, is yes. You can dismiss an employee for their behaviour outside of work. However, as with all dismissals, you should still have to follow fair and proper procedures to avoid ending up at an employment tribunal. So unfair dismissal is one of the main reasons for tribunal claims, and the success of these claims mainly turns on the policies and procedures followed by the employer. Because it's not an employer's job to police what employers do with their own time. Employees do have a right to private life. However, when that private life becomes public, it can be linked to your business, and that's when people need to act. Because outside work will not always be sufficient grounds to secure unfair dismissal. You have to take into account a fairly large amount of considerations.
Yes. So I think let's have a disclaimer on this. We are not HR law specialists. However, this very helpful article was in the Times today, and indeed it references an interview with one of the directors and founders of Peninsula HR. So it's them saying this. But so the point is, though, is that this always comes up whenever there's anything like, in this instance, it's the Euros, but let's face it, every year there's a World Cup or a Euros.
And I mean, we're into the Olympics this year as well. We've got Paris 2024.
Yeah, the Olympics, you've got Six Nations Rugby, you've got cricket, you get the Ashes. And quite often there's instances where people may attend these sorts of things, and have they taken the day as leave? Did the employer know they were going? What is it they're then recorded doing? It's one thing, for example, if you take leave and then you're seen, in this instance, it was the fact that someone's written in saying, well, look, an employee was caught on social media. There was a video recording of them chanting some songs that
inappropriate.
Let's just leave it at that. They were inappropriate England songs. You don't need to imagine too much what those possibly could have been. So there's that element of sort of, hang on, does this person's behaviour then denigrate the reputation of the firm? So, for example, you have to bear in mind, well, what is the role of the person? What is the thing they've been accused of doing? I mean, for example, if, say, you've got someone who is that they end up being seen or doing something that impinges on their, in some way, are they carrying out or being seen to do something fraudulent? So, for example, they were someone who was a regulated professional and they were either a solicitor or a policeman or something, and it was, hang on, there's something here that goes to your behaviour that shows that you're unsuitable to be in your role. That would be a rather key thing.
Yeah.
The other key thing in this article is saying that if anyone is ever dismissed and then they go to the tribunal, it's on the grounds of unfair dismissal, which means that a company's own rules have not been followed. So if your handbook says, you have the right to a written, several layers of warning, and we will, if you are going to, if we do think it's a problem, there will be a meeting and an opportunity for you to put your side of the story and provide evidence. If that's in your handbook, and then you see someone on social media and there's a video, or even potentially you see them on TV, which the leading case law on this relates to from the Euros 20 years ago, where someone was seen throwing bottles at the police.
Yeah.
A bit of kettling was going on, and that ended up being on there. And then it turned out that at the time, the Prime Minister of the time made a comment in Parliament about this person's behaviour and how the employer should come down heavily on them. So the employer did come down heavily on them, and then it all went to a tribunal. But the point here is that if you have a process that outlined in your handbook in terms of how issues like this will be dealt with, make sure you follow them and evidence them. Make sure those meetings happen. You might even want to have an independent person in there to record what's going on and provide a note and say, yes, this was followed, the person had the opportunity to respond, and then they looked at the evidence and then they made a decision, rather than just going, oh, we don't like that, quickly call them, you're fired, leave your stuff in a desk in a box outside the front,
On the flip side, it has also got to be proportionate. Obviously,
Yes.
while following due process is very key, if you've got someone that has been arrested and consequently sent to jail for a potential crime that was committed, and then it directly relates to your company, arguably that's probably fairly good grounds for dismissal, despite due process. But I think it is taking a look at what has been done and what is fair and reasonable as well. Because at the same time, despite it being, you should really try and not plaster things on social media, people can make mistakes. And that is also something worth considering here.
And also it's worth thinking about that, and the social media element on this is important, because there are other social media law cases that show where, for example, someone's made a comment about colleagues or their workplace on social media, and then they've been fired for it, and then they've looked and said, well, hang on, the only people that would have seen this were friends or family of the person who made the comment because of the settings that were on there. So it didn't harm the reputation of the employer. It didn't impinge their brand. This was therefore unfair.
Yeah.
So it does come back to that element of proportionality.
And it's quite interesting, it's the point I raised when we were discussing this piece, was the fact that I am now coming from a generation where I've been taught from quite a young age that you don't plaster stuff on social media that you don't want to essentially come back to haunt you. And as we've seen in this day and age, people will go back through your Twitter timeline to 2009 and take screen grabs and screenshots of comments that were made, maybe out of context, maybe comments that were just, quite frankly, quite silly to make. But nonetheless, it is out there and available. And if it is, you should be censoring what you put online. And if it is something interesting or something that could be maybe construed in the wrong way, send it to the people that know you and know that it won't be construed in the wrong way. Use a little bit of common sense that's clearly not quite as common, and don't circulate it where all can see.
I think that's a good point, that when it comes to digital natives, there will be hopefully that sort of inbuilt thinking of, well, I shouldn't be sharing this sort of stuff anyway. But obviously, we still have a few decades to go until everyone in the workplace is going to be a digital native. So there's still going to be a while of people perhaps posting things and not necessarily thinking about the consequences. Not to mention the things that happen when you get new and different and varied platforms that operate in ways that even those who are skilled in social media might not necessarily appreciate, in terms of how viral something could go or how widely viewed that might ultimately be.
And that's just it. I was saying again before we were recording this podcast, the fact that there was a viral video that went around about two twins. One twin couldn't get the annual leave, couldn't get leave, and so the other twin worked her job in her place. And therefore, very proud of this achievement, she decided to post it online. And consequently, she was then fired. And it's a bit like, okay, so you managed to get away with it. Don't plaster it all over the internet, because, lo and behold, it does come back to bite you. And on that note, I will finish there. So that was our last discussion of the episode. And if you have any questions about what we have talked about today, please email us at admin@digitallawuk.com. A summary of today's stories is also available on our website, as well as the links to the original stories with more background information. And if you'd like to hear more from us, including information about subscriber-only podcasts, webinars, and events, then please subscribe to Premium via our Patreon channel using the link in the show notes. A big thank you again to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this podcast. And if you'd be interested to hear more about Anson Evaluate services, please take a look at their website. You can find it at www.ansonevaluate.com. Just a reminder, these episodes are available on our website, YouTube channel, podcast channels such as Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, and please feel free to leave us a review. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next week.